welcome to MySecTV TV and our new Tech and Sec weekly series looking at the technology and security market trends, and particularly in security, defence and aerospace. My name is Chris Cubbage. I'm the Executive Editor and Director for MySecurity Media, and this follows on from a number of different series that we've been doing, but a new format in terms of this particular week-to-week series. For the format and for the session, our domain focus has stayed the same. So we're still looking at aerospace and defence, aerospace and space, defence and national security, cybersecurity and critical technology, and cities and infrastructure. The platform we are operating on is the GoToWebinar platform, but we're also streaming on our YouTube channel. And the format will be around about a 60 to 90 minute format per week. Some weeks will be a little bit shorter, and this particular episode kicking off will also be within the hour. Our regional supporters, as I mentioned, we've just finished a couple of series. One was the India's Reach series, and then we did a 10-episode Indo-Pacific series with our partners Aerospace and Defence Consultants Association of India, and also our emerging partner, the ISIC Japan, International Security Industry Council there. And we'll have James back on as well to talk to us about their ongoing work. So our two partners in Japan and in India. Last week on our wrap-up for the Indo-Pacific series, we had Ipsotech and Indemia looking at their touchless biometrics and social distancing surveillance technology. Very interesting session, and it was a good way to wrap up that 10 episode series. And it is available also on YouTube and also the MySecurity Marketplace. But today, I'd like to welcome Professor Matthew Warren, who is the Director of the RMIT University Centre for Cybersecurity Research and Innovation. And we're going to look at the foreign interference in the US election, Russia and Iran, weaponises online voter registration information. Professor Warren, thank you very much for joining us.
Good afternoon. Great to be on the show.
Thank you very much, and I'll call you Matthew from here on in as well. But
I'll just Matt.
Very good. Okay, well, Matt it is, and Matt we'll dive into. So let me just catch up on some of our other events that we have, and then we'll dive into our sort of discussion. Just some updates on the marketplace as well, and we've just dropped a couple of podcasts. So one I released last week was episode 225 with Abigail Bradshaw, who is the head of the Australian Cybersecurity Centre, or the ACSC, just discussing her role and obviously the role of the Australian Cybersecurity Centre. Very interesting, and also how they're adapting to the new cybersecurity strategy. And released on Monday, Jane Lowe, our Singapore correspondent. This is a really interesting podcast as well with Charles Perrine, Senior Threat Researcher at Trend Micro, and how his team has been setting up a fake factory as a honeypot, and then putting that so-called OT-related infrastructure out onto the internet to not only see who is attacking it, but how they attack it and how long it takes to attack them. So that's a Black Hat Asia 2020 takeaway and worth having a look at. Also just released today is the Cyber Risk Leaders magazine, issue number 3. It's for the last one for the year. We'll definitely be continuing with these next year. There's about 16 articles there, and our cover feature cloud trends, native, multi, and hybrid. And again, we cover off on general cybersecurity, education, awareness, and corporate risk management. Very, very well put together. If I don't say so myself as the editor, but thank you to our contributors and partners and supporters that help us with that particular issue. Next week, so we're going to take a break on this particular issue, but it's episode, but it's all part of MySecTV and our weekly series. We're going to dive into a 4-part episode with leading security consultants and getting what we are calling the Security Consultant Insight series. I've been able to conjure up about half a dozen leading consultants from Perth, Canberra, Sydney and Melbourne, predominantly SCEC-related consultants, and we're going to have a look at the SCEC requirements for government installations high security buildings, and also the fire considerations for security, that balance of security and fire. So that's starting next week, next Wednesday, on November 4. We're not doing this episode next Tuesday because it's Melbourne Cup Day. Tech and Sec Weekly is also going to be doing a special series of interviews. So we've got Jeff Raby, the former ambassador to China, Australia's former ambassador, and he's just released a new book, and I've just finished reading it. I'm doing a book review. This is China's Grand Strategy and Australia's Future in the New Global Order. This follows off our other book reviews and interviews with Professor Rory Metcalf from ANU on his book on the Indo-Pacific, and also our recent book review and interviews with the Centre for Land Warfare Studies in India on India's strategy also. So 12th of November, it's going to be 9 o'clock on Australian Standard Time, so we can fit in with the Japan, Perth and India time slots as well. So looking forward to that. Okay, so to Matt, in this particular session, Matt, I've got a couple of releases here in what was released. So this is the alert from the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA. It's alert AA20296A and B. And we can come back to these, but effectively this is the Russian release. So this group, this is an APT, commonly known as Berserk Bear, Energetic Bear, Team Spy, Dragonfly, Havix, Crouching Yeti and Koala. So this APT has been identified across open source channels. They're not a new particular group targeting US targets. And I'll just flip over to number B. This is an Iranian group, and they are creating fictitious media sites, spoofing legitimate media sites. I reckon they've obtained US voter registration data, and then spreading anti-American propaganda and misinformation about voter suppression, voter fraud, and ballot fraud. So we can come back to these two, but I thought we'll just have a general discussion about this particular announcement or allegation, but it's, again, it's not new, and it's related to other alerts that were made previous in the year, and even dates back to 2016. So, yeah, Matt, your initial take on it from a researcher and a professional's viewpoint.
I think what we're just dealing with is the new normal. You know, since 2007, you know, when we saw the Estonian online infrastructure, you know, taken down by Russia, and cyber militias acting on behalf of Russia, we've just seen, you know, capabilities of countries developing. So certainly when we talk about those state threat actors, you know, we're really talking about Russia, we're talking about China, we're talking about Iran, and we're talking about North Korea. And what's very different is that they have different capabilities, they have different outcomes that they're focused on, and they also have different targets for their attacks. So certainly from a Russian perspective, they're, you know, one of the most mature state threat actors, and what they see cyber as is a projection of their power, of their influence, and Russia are able to undertake a whole range of activities. They have the Internet Research Agency, a pseudo organization in St. Petersburg, that's involved in election manipulation and fake news across Europe, across the Baltic, into sort of the US. We have, then you have state-supported hacking groups, really extension of government, you know, who then undertake cyber attacks on behalf of the Russian government. You know, we saw that with the power outages, attacks in the Ukraine. We've seen that with the threats on critical infrastructure in the US, and that's just Russia. We can talk about China, Iran, and North Korea, and they have different capabilities and different targets. But what we've seen in the current sort of situation, I suppose, is a convergence. Is what we've seen. Well, what we saw in the 2016 presidential election was that Russia was very involved in it. They were very involved in hacking hacking and dumping. So we saw the Democrat Party hacked and their materials dumped via WikiLeaks. We saw fake news, social media manipulation, and that had a real impact on the presidential election. But what we've seen now in 2020 is it isn't just Russia. It's now China. It's also now Iran as well. So what we're seeing, is Russia and Iran, dealing with the same sorts of data in terms of trying to disrupt and manipulate an election. It isn't. So what they've done, it really isn't very sophisticated. What they've done is they've brought on the dark web state voter registration lists. So in the US, they have these email lists where people's details are recorded that include, the party affiliation, email address, phone number, contact details, sold on the dark web. Each state has them. Lapse of security meant that sort of information was, passed on to them. And what they then sent was they looked at that state list for voters in Pennsylvania and Florida, and they then sent an email to those voters pretending to be from the Proud Boys, who are sort of a right-wing group, saying that we know about you, we know how you voted, you need to change your allegiance or else. So it's really just like a spam attack. So what we've not seen, is any attack on the election infrastructure, the voting system. But what we've seen with Russia and Iran in terms of their activities is what they're trying to do is actually, in terms of the outcome of that cyber attack, is actually erode people's perception of the democratic process. So what they want is the people to become disengaged and not take part in the democratic process, not feel they have an association with government. And I've spent a lot of time physically in the Baltic states in Europe, working with Baltic government agencies and universities there, seeing firsthand how Russia, over an extended period of time, has tried to use these attacks to try to erode the democratic support of those Baltic countries, and then seeing the steps that those Baltic countries are taking, to protect their sovereignty and to protect their sort of, the democratic processes. So what we have is a situation, especially with Russia, where literally they're able to switch this style of attack from one election to another. And we've seen it with the Ukraine, we've seen it with Georgia, we've seen it in the Scandinavian, Baltic states, we've seen it in the UK with Brexit. So again, it's the same, in essence, the same pattern, but what we're seeing is a sophistication. So what's different with this presidential election is there's a lot more awareness in the US about these sorts of attacks and fake news. So what Russia has done, they've changed their tactics. So what they're doing is actually paying paying politicians or using politicians to spread that false narrative. So we have a situation in the Ukraine where opposition MPs are now, spreading this disinformation. We're also seeing the Russians actually hiring legitimate journalists to write news articles, again spreading this false narrative, and then sharing those news releases with bona fide media outlets, because those stories have come from trusted freelance journalists. They're then sort of picked up on. Other work I've been doing during the Black Lives Movement campaign, I was sort of following botnets on Twitter, again, seeing how they were controlled by state threat actors, were being used to spread memes and false information and fake narrative. So what we have now is just a sophistication of the ability to attack and manipulate a democratic process with the aim of causing, people to be disengaged and eroding faith in those democratic processes, particularly elections.
I think, as you mentioned in the alert, it's Russia and Iran, and Russia's sort of known for it, and they haven't really probably gone away, as you say, now getting to the point of hiring journalists. Do you think the journalists would be fully aware or just complacent in that, or is it completely sort of dark arts?
Again, literally, they've been hired to write these sort of articles, and they've really not known the context of them. So it's been done through sort of shadow entities. So again, and it's just the new normal, that we're in, and you have a country that has this sort of capability, and what they're doing is learning from their mistakes, they're evolving their strategies, and what we're just seeing is that evolution. In terms of Iran, what we're seeing is them, really undertake these sorts of attacks, but at a lower level of sort of capability. So they're trying to spread misinformation on fake news, fake social media accounts. But what you have is that Facebook and Twitter actually have a greater capability to pick up these fake accounts and shut them down. So this is something Iran's only just becoming involved with. But
even as that alert says, Iran's been trying to take over legitimate media sites, and take control of that. And it's very difficult with the amount of media out there now, unless you've got some sort of machine learning that's trying to pick up changes in language, it's going to be very, very difficult to stop it before it gets out to the audience at any point, yeah?
Exactly, and this is why fake news and disinformation is so powerful, because if you haven't made up your mind about a certain topic and you receive information online that, helps you make that opinion, for you then to be told, well, that was fake news, isn't then going to change that opinion that you've made. So this is why fake news and disinformation is so powerful, because once people have made their opinions or decisions based on that, it's hard then to change it just because you've identified something as being sort of fake or misinformation. And this is why... And this is why, countries like Russia and Iran are spending so much time and effort. China is different. What China is using these manipulation campaigns for is much more, to influence messaging. So it's messaging around, their position in the world, around, China's position around COVID and positive stance, the one China perspective. And in terms of North Korea, their cyber activities are very much involved in trying to generate sort of income for that country, or to directly attack what they consider adversaries, the classic example being Sony Pictures in the USA with the Guardians of Peace when that dictator film came out.
I think, so what we've seen and what we're hearing about in terms of even just this conversation is Iran, Russia, China, North Korea. What about the Five Eyes in the US? Because rather than just taking a defensive alert and awareness viewpoint, we're hearing a lot about cyber offensive and capability building, even here in Australia as well. What are you seeing from the other side? I mean, US historically have done this as well. So, no doubt they're also doing their work in a sort of an offensive or countering aspect, but we don't often get to hear it or see it. What's from the other side happening as well?
Well, certainly, we have the counter narrative. We've certainly seen from the Australian government that they acknowledge that the Australian government was able to take down an ISIS propaganda group that was spreading, pro-ISIS information. The problem we have is this concept of strike back. in terms of who has the authority to do that, and certainly in the new discussion paper around critical infrastructure in terms of Australia, what's being proposed is that government would have the ability to act on behalf of critical infrastructure providers to strike back against cyber adversaries, even if they're sort of state threat actors.
Yeah. Something just briefly, sorry, Matthew, Matt, we just touched on that with Abigail Bradshaw with the Australian Cybersecurity Centre in our podcast with her. The legislation is still coming, and the exercises are still got to be run so they understand how they do that. But obviously, the Australian government's preparing itself for that eventuation. Should a system be taken over or compromised, and obviously that includes our sort of voting system as well. Yeah. Maybe more from and we can talk more into the crime aspects too. Child pornography, there's been a big ring just taken out as well. So obviously the capability is there, but other than that population awareness, what are some of the other key aspects that we need to be doing? Because even in the technical guidance and the technical notes on these alerts, there's a lot there. They're coming in at a lot of different angles, a lot of vulnerabilities. It's a really hard one to combat, right?
And certainly, when you're talking about critical infrastructure, you're dealing with the issue of legacy systems. When you're talking about SCADA systems, you're dealing with systems that haven't been patched. You're dealing with legacy systems where where the vendor may not even be in business anymore, so there isn't sort of necessary security to patch with. And in this is the problem, is actually the complexity of critical infrastructure, the management of complex systems that have such an impact upon entire populations make them a very attractive targets for foreign adversaries. So, this has been known for decades, around the vulnerabilities that critical infrastructure face, but yet it's still very difficult to protect critical infrastructure against the whole variety of cyber risks. And really, I'm very supportive of what the government is doing and proposing with their white paper, is that partnership between government and critical infrastructure providers, to protect Australian critical infrastructure, I think is key. Because critical infrastructure providers, they wouldn't have those capabilities for offensive operations. They, in terms of the issue of false positives of where the attack's coming from, they wouldn't have that sort of understanding. But you have a situation where the government has a duty of care to protect Australia and our citizens, and now in the cyberspace, our systems. But what we're also seeing when we talk about cyber is the inclusion of space as well. And I think what we're seeing is also a greater awareness that space is also, forming part of Australia's critical infrastructure, and the protection of our spatial systems is also going to become, much more important into the future.
Yeah, I think it's funny. We started off the US elections, we end up in space, and it's often. But if you had just read my editorial today for the magazine, I end up doing exactly the same thing. I think the key aspect here, if anything, as you say, it's supportive of the government, but I've always kind of been advocating they should have been doing this a while ago, and we've had a lot of conversations over the years, because most of critical infrastructure is in private industry. And there's an interview I did even back in the States back in 2012. Yeah. Again, the engagement between, what was relatively new then, the Department of Homeland Security, realising that most critical infrastructure is in the private sector. So there's a lot of engagement, but how rapid this is happening, government just doesn't work that quickly. I suppose closing comment on the voting systems themselves. Is it a sign that the voting system itself is relatively robust, that they are moving towards the sort of the disinformation and the misinformation, which is easier to do?
Yeah, it is, because there's now the greater awareness of the type of attack. So certainly in the US, there's a greater awareness of Department of National Intelligence, Homeland Security, the different state electoral bodies, around the vulnerabilities of the electoral system. So there's been much more effort put into that, which is why the adversaries are focusing very much on this sort of disinformation, fake news, but also from a return of effort, it has a greater impact. From their perspective, if you're able to get this sort of false narrative out to a mass market, than it is, trying to hack into one electoral system in one state. So even the adversaries, in terms of impact of their attacks, see fake news and disinformation is having a much greater impact.
I did, there was a brief touch on the Australian Cybersecurity Centre released their cut and paste compromises report, 19th of June, I think Abigail reminded me of. But have you seen any correlation to that type of attack in these releases? Have you looked at something like that? Is that something that they're dealing with as well?
So certainly in Australia at the last election, that there was a task force formed to look at protecting our election, and it involved intelligence agencies, the ACSC, the Electoral Commission, and there was no sort of incidents identified. What I haven't seen is that same apparatus being rolled out for state elections. So again, we've got. We're going to have our third state election this year, with Queensland election coming up, and I suppose that's always a weakness. Is you could potentially protect the Commonwealth election, but what about the state elections and local elections as well?
And saying that, being here in Australia, in Sydney, we hear about the election, but I've not heard any kind of announcement or release from the state or federal government about that in terms of getting populations aware of potential fake news in that. So I think you've planted the seed there, and no doubt someone will look to exploit that. Matt, I'm conscious of the time. We were going to do a 4:30 Sydney time finish. Thank you so much for that particular insights from yourself. We would look to have you back if we don't mind, and I think maybe if you've been looking at the space domain, it's something we'll definitely be covering in future. So I'll take you on notice for that.
It's been my absolute pleasure. It's been wonderful to be part of the show. Thank you.
Good on you. Thanks, Matt. Appreciate your time. Bye. And I'll let you go. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye.
Okay, I'll let you sign off. Good on you. Okay, so thank you for that with Professor Matthew Warren, Director of RMIT University Centre for Cybersecurity Research and Innovation. Just to finish off, as we normally do, just the latest threat reports that have come out in the last week or so on the marketplace. These are from Nokia, Trustwave, Akamai, and VMware Carbon Black. VMware, the Global Incident Response Threat Report, kind of headlined as a perfect storm, and I think it came out like the day before these US election alerts came out, and they were talking literally about the cyber risk and the risk of compromise of the US election and misinformation campaign. So well done to VMware Carbon Black on that one. Some of the events that are on today and this week, we've got Telecoms World Asia, APAC Fraud Summit, and the Cloud Transformation Champions online in the US, and the Australia-India Innovation Bridge Cybersecurity Business Conclave. And on the 18th of November over in Perth, but also a virtual event with Microsoft and from Israel, Razor Labs, and we're proud media partners with this. And this is looking at the exponential disruption, how AI is harnessing disruption and creating competitive advantage in our ever-accelerating complex world of data overload and fast chaos. I mentioned on Wednesday, so this is on tomorrow, with the Australia-India Innovation Bridge Program and their Cybersecurity Business Conclave, and we're pleased to be involved with that tomorrow also. And just a few days to go, you've got the Singapore Computer Society, I think is the IT Leaders Awards 2021 Tech Heroes from Crisis. Closes on 31st of October. So I want to run through some news, if we can, for the week from Professor Dali Kafar and his team, Gianchino Tangari and Mohammed Ikram from the Optus Macquarie University Cybersecurity Hub have just released a security audit of Australian government websites, very timely. Just some three key takeaways. I'm going to try and reach out to Professor Kafar and get him on the show. The first one, in terms of these are their three takeaway notes. It's a very detailed, insightful report. 15% of the analysed websites are still using plain text HTTP. Very interesting in that context when they should all be HTTPS by now, I would hope. The second takeaway was a non-negligible portion of all analysed HTTPS websites present insecure server configurations. And third, most of the analysed websites include vulnerable content in their actual web pages. So very interesting in that relation too. So we'll have that full report on the marketplace tomorrow and released in the Australian Cybersecurity Magazine website. Some final news, the Australian government upgrades to the information systems for Navy ships, with over $600 million being invested in a new fleet information system, and a deployed network integration centre is to be established in Canberra, a little bit like the collaboration centre in Adelaide that we talked to a couple of weeks ago as well. Qlink has acquired Blender. These are analytics platforms for real-time data integration and automation layers. Just looking at these layers here, interesting in terms of connectivity layers, the integration layers, user interface and embedding layers, and then the management layers in terms of central management for customers' integrations, templates, and embedding into a cloud platform. Interesting to have a look at that. Cato Networks is making a move in Australia and New Zealand as well with their Cato Cloud. So they've appointed Brett Waddington, their regional sales director, and Tan Kong, their sales engineer for ANZ, one to look at for Cato. I mentioned the A3C, the Australian Cyber Collaboration Centre. So they've officially launched their cyber range, their cyber test range. I think this was on the October 19 with a global cyber security competition, I think run by Qlink. So that's one to keep an eye out, and hopefully we'll hear more from A3C also. Kavira has been spun out of Sourced. So it looks like the Source team has come out with a cloud security product that looks at the governance policies and applies them across multi-cloud environments. Looks relatively interesting. They're going to be operating out of Sydney and Toronto and led by Vernon Jefferson and Neil Brown, both taking on the CTO and VP of Operations respectively. On our Drastic channel, Drones and Robotics, the UAVionics has filed for an FAA TSO application for what they have called the world's first certified drone transponder. Again, it is on our drasticnews.com channel. That's a 50-gram ping 200 times mode single ADS-B transponder. So yeah, the fact that you even get onto a drone, if it's only 50 grams, that makes it very interesting. And this was back in September, but the release only came out. So the launch was in September. So this is an experimental satellite about the size of a cereal box, injected from a rockets dispenser along with 45 other similar small satellites. They're traveling at about 530 kilometers overhead in a sun-synchronous orbit. And the FISAT-1 contains a hyperspectral thermal camera and onboard AI processing from Intel, their Movitus Myriad 2 vision processing unit. And this is the same chip that we're finding in our smart cameras and in selfie drones. So one to have a look at. They're testing for inter-satellite communication systems to create a future network of federated satellites. So we'll keep an eye on that one. Vivatech just released a couple of cameras in line, their Insight series, and these are aligned with the Open Security and Safety Alliance, the OSSA. So that's on our CCTV buyer's guide. And TDSI have launched a new Gardas Bluetooth low energy reader, and we had TDSI on one of our original episodes also. And last few is HackerOne is expanded their integrations and their ecosystem, adding to their workflows. They've got PagerDuty, ServiceNow, Qlink, and Sumo Logic. Idemia, this is an interesting one with Idemia, MatchMove, and MasterCard on piloting a fingerprint biometric card in Asia. The F-Code Easy takes your biometric authentication from a smartphone and then applies it to the smart card. So they're looking at MatchMove is one of the 21 applicants for Singapore's digital banking licenses, and obviously the biometric there is a nice to have. And Global Data have asked a key question here: to what extent will the following technologies help your company recover from the COVID-19 downturn? And the top three responses were cybersecurity, cloud computing, and automation technologies. Fourth one there I'll throw in is Internet of Things. So cybersecurity really leading the way with 50%, over 50% saying that cybersecurity has a significant role in their technologies moving forward. And to finish off, Nokia, we mentioned space. Nokia have been selected by NASA to build a new LTE 4G network on the moon. This made mainstream news. I imagine you would have heard about it. So NASA's human program will be back on the moon in 2024 with a more permanent human presence on the moon planned for 2030. So that's the news from the marketplace and our relatively first episode of MySecurity TV Tech and Sec Weekly. Thank you very much to Professor Matt Warren, Director of RMIT University Centre for Cybersecurity Research and Innovation, the foreign interference in the US election, looking at how Russia and Iran are weaponising online voter registration information. Thank you very much for joining us. This session will be available on YouTube and on MySecurity TV. And on that note, we'll finish off here. Thank you very much for joining us.